So as Dean mentioned, I'm going to try and talk a little bit today about some concepts around feeding sows for maximum lifetime performance. And really before I get into it, there's a lot of unknowns in this whole area that continues to be a pretty active work area altogether. And really this presentation was put together with the assistance of a lot of people within the PIC Tech Services team and out in the industry that we cross paths with. But Dean mentioned up front a little bit about trying to increase the overall productive life of a sow. And I think that that's probably an oversimplification of ultimately what we're trying to do. None of us should be very interested in having a bunch of 8, 9, 10-year-old sows in our farm that haven't been productive during that time period. Michelangelo said there's no greater harm than that of time wasted, and when I go in some breeding barns and see sows that have been standing around there for a long time, that might be one representation of that. So typically we try and move past that to some more tangible metrics around the overall herd life efficiency, things like parity at removal or moving towards pigs per day of productive life, or ultimately even lifetime pigs produced per gilt entered into the GDU. Back in 2007, while I was at Smithfield, I had the opportunity to work with a group that was looking at some different causes of variation or what was driving some of this difference in herd life. And really as a starting point, I want to try and frame up the discussion a bit with what we're trying to look at here today. This slide attempts to show that the difference between high-performing or high-retention herds and average retention or low-retention herds is predominantly entirely defined by that time period from when a select gilt is entered into the sow farm until she farrows that second parity litter. At that point in time, we see almost a 20 percentage point spread between high retention herds and low retention herds. At the same time, as we get later on into life, the slope of retention or the rate of retention becomes much more constant between those different scenarios. And we don't see as dramatic of difference after that point. So really, again, pointing us towards the fact that if we want to improve the overall retention of the breeding female, specifically those sows or those gilts coming into the breeding herd, really need to be one of the initial targets that we focus on. This is a slide that Juan Carlos Pinilla and the PIC Tech Service team put together, but I'm sure lots of people have seen slides similar to this in the past. What it really reinforces is that if we set those gilts up for a maximum or optimum performance at the beginning of their life cycle, they tend to be the higher performing animals through the entire life cycle and time they spend in the herd. By far the largest variation that we see across a large number of commercial farms is in that first parity. But when we look at stratifying out the high-performing individuals and those individuals that are likely to stay productive over time versus the lower-performing individuals or those that may be more likely to be culled for various forms of reproductive success, ultimately, this again points to the need to try and differentiate ourselves with respect to a gilt development program. The slide on the screen here, and for those in the back of the room, you're probably going to have to take my word on what's actually on there, but it's just the summary of a lit review from several different presentations or retrospective analysis looking at the reasons that we're culling sows out of herds. These go all the way back to 1960 and up through 2000, and the one thing that's consistent all through that time period is the reasons really haven't changed dramatically. The largest reason that females ultimately leave the breeding herd is due to reproductive failure and poor performance, things associated with failure to breed or failure to conceive, or just substandard litter performance. The second is really around old age and feet and leg and structure issues. And then mortality and injury as a broad grouping is probably the third most common reason of sow culls. Can everybody hear me okay back there? It's gotten quiet up here. It's probably better back there. Okay? Another thing as we try and frame up this overall topic that I'm going to try and talk about a little bit today is the impact of seasonal infertility. And seasonal infertility to me just means that during certain time periods of the year, we have females or a breeding population that are less likely to have a normal, successful reproductive event. And this probably shouldn't be completely unexpected. History says that pigs are a seasonal breeder, and we've tried to go across the top of that with our more intensive production systems and move them to non-seasonal breeders to increase the overall efficiency of those mating populations. But as we look at the concepts of seasonal infertility and ultimately what they result in with respect to reproductive failure, it clearly can have a negative impact on the overall rate of breeding female retention or involuntary culls going out of those farms. We see it with respect to increases in wean to service interval, irregular returns, or a larger gap between conception rate and farrowing rate, and the number of anestrus gilts that get culled out of the population before they successfully make it into the herd. Ultimately, this then results in a decrease in farrowing rate, and combined with the lower per litter performance, a decrease in the overall number of pigs weaned, moving through specific time periods of the annual cycle. So with all of these things rolled up in trying to keep breeding females active and productive so that they become voluntary culls for us to maximize our herd efficiency versus involuntary culls that we have to respond to, there's several big reasons that ultimately drive this as an important economic consideration. One, a higher replacement rate and greater numbers of gilts coming through the system ultimately result in a higher wean pig cost. Secondly, around the globe, this is becoming more and more of a topic with respect to potential welfare implications and what that might mean for different parts of our industry going forward. And then there's been lots of research done looking at progeny of gilt litters compared to progeny of more mature sows. And one thing that we consistently see is that those progeny from gilts have a less developed or a less advanced immune system. We see higher medication costs, higher mortality, and decreased wean to finish performance. So really, as we look at the economic drivers of focusing on maximizing sow lifetime performance, it's a combination of different things, both from a sow farm perspective, but then ultimately a birth to market perspective within those populations. So with that as a backdrop of some of the reasons why we need to focus on this as a topic and some of the specific points of differentiation between higher performing systems or farms and more average or lower performing systems and farms, when we look at what causes fallout of the breeding female population, we'll try and talk a little bit about some specific ideas around how to keep animals in the herd for a greater period of time. This fancy diagram up on the screen right now was developed by our tech service team trying to map out or take a look at the overall life cycle of a breeding female. It starts up here at the beginning of this green line with birth of that replacement gilt, and she goes through a development cycle until she reaches the point of her first breeding. Once that happens, she enters what we hope is a productive and long and efficient cycle of breeding to farrowing to weaning back to breeding again. So as we try and take a look at some different opportunities or ideas to focus on to improve this, we're really going to try and focus on three distinct phases of that cycle. The first is the gilt development phase, or that time from when the gilt was born until she goes into the breeding barn and hopefully efficiently conceives her first litter. The second is the breeding to farrowing time period, represented by the red on the graph there. And then the third, rather than a farrow to wean, we're going to call it a farrow to breeding cycle, or the period from when she farrows until when she successfully breeds the next time. As we go through the rest of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about some of the management considerations designed to try and maximize some of these different components, as well as a few specific examples of diets and ingredients. The Gilt development program really starts off and sets the stage for the future success of the farm as a whole. If we remember back to the previous slide, the impact of P1 performance is a great barometer and predictor of what we expect that population of individuals or that cohort of animals is ultimately going to do and deliver. And today, I believe that we can increase the chances to get better P1 performance with ad lib feeding until first breeding to ensure optimum growth rate, and a flushing effect going into that first breeding event to maximize litter size in P1, and a heat no service program where at least 95% of the gilts are getting bred on their second or third cycle. The first step to allow us to do and accomplish this, I believe, really begins with the design of the GDU facility. Today, it's much more common to have gilt development units either on site with the sows or some fairly dedicated space to go along with a couple of sow farms than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And this gives us a great opportunity to manage these females differently and to set them up for future success. At the same time, it really in response to various health challenges, we've come up with health strategies such as herd closure and other things that influence how we flow animals through these facilities, how we load them up, how we empty them out. And ultimately, if we're going to design a well-managed system that allows for flexibility to be dynamic in response to some of these situations, there needs to be as much thought put into the front side as possible on things like stocking density, floor type, feeder and water space, to really allow those animals, whatever we think that cohort group might be, to express their full potential for positive growth leading up to the time of that first breeding, and to minimize the impact on involuntary culls due to various feet and leg issues or other things that may negatively influence the quality of the gilt going into those sow farms. From a nutrition-specific consideration, I think this probably summarizes the majority of our recommendations today. And when we think about how important gilt development is, probably also speaks to the continued need for various groups within the industry to conduct research and focus in this area. We would recommend ad-libited feeding for maximum performance all the way up to time of first breeding. A lysine calorie ratio that could be very similar to market hogs from an overall growth and efficiency standpoint. But really with the inclusion of gilt-specific diets after approximately 135 pounds that would have increased micronutrients such as higher calcium and phosphorus, potential inclusion of organic minerals like zinc, manganese, or copper. We do want to try to avoid terminal market diets through this time period. There's some products out there that are designed to help make market pig growth more efficient in their late finishing period. Those aren't necessarily positive things for a group of replacement gilts moving through the pipeline. And various people start to include the sow vitamin trace mineral pack at this point of the life cycle. A slide here, adopted from some work that Gonzalo did, looks at the impact of lifetime average daily gain of the gilt on their P1 litter size. And what this clearly shows is we have higher performing, growthier gilts that we still identify, find in heat, and breed at the right age and weight. That's the tool for us to maximize that first litter parity performance. Ultimately, it does reach a threshold here, and if we allow these gilts to get too big before we ultimately breed them, there can be some negatives associated with that. But a good, high-quality, healthy gilt that's growing fast leading up to breeding is typically a good recipe to have a gilt that reaches puberty at an early age and is productive in the sow herd. A study looking at some of the work around flushing gilts pre-breeding is represented on this slide that was originally presented by some of the PIC group at ASV last year. What this slide attempts to look at is several sow farms that were not maximizing intake of the gilts in that time period leading up to breeding in the sow farm. Moving those gilts into the farm, the stress associated with that, putting them in crates for the first time, there's a lot of things that can negatively impact a gilt's intake in that period immediately preceding when we expect her to breed and conceive and farrow a large, high-quality first litter. This was a project done across 6 farms where we thought that there was an opportunity to accelerate or exaggerate the feed intake in terms of flushing pre-breeding. And what we see is on these farms when we implemented that, a fairly consistent and large increase in first parity litter size in those gilts that had access to greater amounts of feed leading up to the breeding event. Now, ultimately, that's only a positive if there's an economic return associated with it, not just a biological bump in performance. And when we look at that with 18 days of full feed, eating roughly 2.5 additional pounds of feed per day, we still see a margin over feed cost of approximately $34 per gilt, with exposing those animals to greater amounts of feed leading up to the time of breeding. We talked a little bit about looking at trying to maximize the growth rate of gilts during that development period, to have healthy, growthy gilts that reach puberty and cycle at a young age, that ultimately are more cost efficient to put into the breeding herd. At the same time, as we change those growth rates of the animals, we want to make sure that we still find those animals in heat and get them bred in that 300 to 320 pound window. This is some data where we looked at the effect of old and heavy gilts above the target weight range. And what we see is, even though we can get a large number of those gilts to cycle and conceive effectively in their first parity, ultimately those gilts that are too heavy and likely in too heavy of condition going into the gestation barn the first time, we have a harder time getting them to eat in the farrowing house at their first parity and managing their body condition. And ultimately, as they go back to farrow their second parity, we see an overall decline in their second parity litter size, as well as an increase in the wean to service interval of those animals that have a harder time reaching that first parity at the right weight and body condition. This becomes important as we continue to select for leaner and more efficient females. They can still conceive and breed and reach puberty at young ages, but we need to make sure that we work to identify those animals in heat at the appropriate time and not let them get too big and heavy before we put them into the gestation flow. A topic that's becoming increasingly relevant, not just here in North America, but around the world, is how we combine the gilt development program with a good training process for gilts going into electronic sow feeding. Clearly today, not every gilt that goes into an electronic sow feeding system is going to train appropriately to that system, and some of those animals are going to fall out. We believe with the training processes and programs that are in place today, that's a very, very small percentage, or should be a very, very small percentage. At the same time, if it's causing that type of impact on some gilts, it's only reasonable to assume that it can also negatively impact that base or general intake level of the other females within that gilt development flow. And I think that you see today various programs associated with starting the training process out at a much younger age or a much lighter weight to try and make sure as those gilts reach the point of breeding, we've got them back on a positive nutritional plane and they can successfully go into the breeding population. This is a slide that I borrowed from Noel Williams at Iowa Select, looking at the impact of health acclimation programs on replacement gilts. This specific scenario looked at either utilizing live PRRS virus for acclimation or a commercial vaccine, where they started with equal number of animals. Now, ultimately, we want those sows or those gilts to enter the breeding population as well acclimated from a health perspective as possible. But again, if we look at some of the underlying differences between these groups, we see a much higher mortality rate in the LVI group than the vaccine cohort, and a much lower average daily gain, a much lower selection rate, and when we look at the percentage of gilts that are successfully achieving or recording a heat no service event over the first 28 or 35 days, a difference there. Ultimately, really coming out of the same sow farm and just exposed to two different management practices, a difference in either 519 or 768 gilts that are bred and entered into the sow population, a lower farrowing rate and a lower total born on those gilts as well. This isn't to say that different types of health acclimation strategies don't have their fit in specific scenarios, but again, as we look at challenging those replacement females early on and the impact that it can have on them successfully growing and developing into breeding females, all of those things come at a cost and need to be considered from an optimization standpoint. Moving a bit from out of the gilt development and back into the breeding herd itself, there's been a lot of work done looking at the impact of maximizing lactation intake and ultimately the positive role that it can have on decreasing the incidence of reproductive failure and having animals getting culled out of the sow herd. This is some data from a PIC population done with JBS United, where we see that for lactation feeding, they either had a slow, which would have been a conventional step-up type of lactation feeding program, an aggressive feeding program with a much shorter step-up scenario post-farrowing, or really just full access to on-demand feed. And what we see is a significant differential in the two more aggressive lactation feeding programs and the slow feeding with respect to the percentage of sows that were cycling and bred within 7 days post-weaning. When we go back to those initial slides and think about the primary causes that influence sows falling out of the herd as a cull or an involuntary cull, reproductive success is obviously one of them, and this remains an area or an opportunity in a lot of situations to increase the overall productivity and performance of the sow herd. Similarly, some work done in cooperation with the ISS group at Carthage, looking at a range of lactation average daily feed intakes and their impact on total born and weaned to estrus interval. Again, just reinforcing the concept that if we want to have productive sows and we want them to go back into the breeding barn and conceive quickly and efficiently, maximizing lactation feed intake is clearly a good place to start. A little bit relative to the diets, I think one of the areas from a nutrition perspective that's changed with respect to sow diets over the last 5 to 10 years is the amount of lysine that we're feeding in lactation. It wasn't too long ago that a lysine percent of 0.9 in lactation was probably a pretty common level. Today, with the leaner genotypes, raising more pigs, having more pigs, we're expecting them to milk and wean heavy pigs and then rebreed efficiently. We see lactation lysine levels going up to probably somewhere around 1.05, or ultimately trying to get about 62 or 63 grams per day of lysine into a lot of those sows. This not only has a positive impact on litter weight gain, but it also seems to keep sows from getting milked down too heavy and coming back into the herd at a more efficient and a more timely rate. Continuing the discussion around the time period of farrowing to breeding and really making it about farrowing to breeding and not just about farrowing to weaning. This is a preliminary proof of concept, and across the y-axis or up and down the y-axis here you have pounds of feed consumed on a daily basis from the day of weaning out through day 5 post-weaning for a set of weaned sows. And one of the big things that I think this shows is that as those sows return to the wean row, they're still programmed and have a capacity to eat a lot more feed than what we were prepared to give them in the past. We have sows here that even over that first 5-day period up until the normal wean to estrus interval, they were still averaging 10 or 11 pounds of feed during that time window. And really this concept led a group working on it to kind of firmly identify that when well managed and healthy, weaned sows are going to continue to eat immediately post-weaning much more feed than what we were prepared to feed them in the past. And we believe that this is a key value driver in the overall success and rate of that next litter. From a practical implementation standpoint, ultimately in a lot of systems with the way feed lines are run, this is going to require potentially feeding 2 times a day in this situation, or cart feeding a second time. And we need to be careful about running water down the troughs too early and not giving those sows adequate time to go ahead and consume all of that intake. But when we look at what the impact may be, and this was one of the initial studies, we saw a decrease in wean to service interval of 1.4 days, about 8% more sows rebreeding within 7 days, and again, a sizable increase in the subsequent litter size. That was followed up with another larger study looking at much the same thing, where the control was the normal post-weaning feeding strategy, and the trial was more of an ad-lib feeding. Looking at the average daily feed intake of those two groups, the controls were eating about 5.5 pounds of feed per day. The trial group was eating a little over 9 pounds of feed per day in between weaning and the subsequent breeding. But again, we see the same thing. A reduction in wean to service interval, a greater percentage of sows bred by 7 days, and a larger subsequent litter size. Again, making sure that we're not just improving biological performance at the expense of overall cost of production. Those added pounds of feed, in this case, about 11 additional pounds over that time period, versus the additional revenue generated by more pigs, delivers a margin over feed cost of a little over $32 per sow. So another tangible way to potentially influence the overall reproductive success of weaned sows coming out of the farrowing house and ultimately translating back into higher overall rates of performance. Dean mentioned a little bit earlier that I was going to present some new information looking at some nutrition work. I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. David Rosero, who's not able to attend here today. David did some work in the Hanor system looking at some alternative nutritional strategies really around the area or focusing on the concept of seasonal infertility. One of the components of David's dissertation was really looking at fatty acids and essential fatty acids for sow nutrition. And there was a concern about the potential subfeeding of essential fatty acids and what that may influence with respect to overall rates of sow herd performance. This graph or this figure on the slide looks at the percentage of linoleic acid in the diet and its impact on conception rate, represented by the white bar, the clear white bar on the left, and farrowing rate, represented by the striped bar on the right. And what we see as we go from very little linoleic acid up to higher levels is really no impact on conception rate, but the ability to modulate that conception to farrowing success, ultimately resulting in a smaller differential between conception rate and farrowing rate and greater reproductive success. Realizing that reproductive failure is one of the primary issues that causes culling from the sow herd, if we take that last slide and just look at the subsequent cull rates from sows that were exposed to these treatments, again, it shouldn't be unexpected that when we look at cull rates with higher linoleic acid, we certainly have lower cull rates compared to those treatments that were not supplemented at the same level. Finally, just a couple slides, maybe putting a bit more quantitative information around those last graphs. This is a slide looking at linoleic acid intake in terms on a daily basis and the overall farrowing rate. And again, we see a clear increasing trend up to a certain point where it appears that we've reached the requirement or the threshold and very little positive impact after that. And similarly on total born here, we do see a subtle increasing trend for total born, much more noise and variation at levels where the intake is lower than a more consistent response out at the top end. It's probably reasonable to believe all of these studies were done on mature sows during the typical period of seasonal infertility, and it clearly looks like there's a positive benefit there based on this data. But likewise, it probably isn't unrealistic to expect that looking at older, more mature sows that may get depleted from parity cycle to parity cycle, there may also be a positive impact in looking at ingredients like this with respect on their overall performance in herd life. For those like me that don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to the linoleic acid market on a daily basis, trying to take a look at how the sourcing gets in there a little bit. This is a wide range of added energy options, and typically we value all of those added energy options just based on the energy that they're going to provide, the kcals or megacals or ME of energy that they're going to provide on a unit basis. And we see that probably not necessarily unexpectedly, a lot of those ingredients tend to be relatively similar in price when we look at specific time windows relative to their ability to contribute added energy. At the same time, what this looks like is the cost to add linoleic acid to the diet. Tallow is up here in a box to the right. This is from 2013. At that point, tallow basically is not an option to provide linoleic acid or some essential fatty acids. And we see much more variation when we look at some of those sources on their cost efficiency of getting that specific essential fatty acid into the diet. So ultimately, as we try and wrap up here, what does all of this mean? I'd go back and start with the first bullet point again, suggesting that we need to have a good plan on gilt development. Facilities and flows that allow us to optimize performance of the developing gilts both on a routine basis as well as on those special scenarios that tend to become a routine in most of our gilt development units or gilt development flows today. Good growing gilt performance ultimately equals good sow performance if we manage those gilts and get them identified in heat and bred into the herd at the right point. And time spent on gilt development and continued focus on research on gilt development, I would say, continues to be a good investment. Things around heat no serve, flushing pre-breeding, and ESF training are always good opportunity areas for farm and farm staff to focus on. Managing the sow herd has two distinct phases or two distinct periods for feeding. I would suggest today that breeding to farrowing is somewhat less exciting and better understood than the rest, and it's really about managing body condition of those sows to maximize intake going back in. There's a lot of people today taking sow herds through gestation at thinner body conditions than I think any of us would have thought practical or prudent not too many years ago. And from farrowing to breeding, all the way to breeding, I believe it's important to really focus on maximizing good intake of those sows so they not only milk and wean a heavy litter, but they also rebreed efficiently and have large litters at subsequent parity. And then finally, changing reality should cause us to continue to challenge our perspectives. The sows that we're producing today and that we're utilizing in our commercial farms, when they have the opportunity to reach their genetic potential, they're producing more pounds of milk on a day basis in lactation than a Holstein dairy cow. They're producing almost twice as many weaned pigs in practice on some of the high-producing farms that the industry as a whole did not too long ago. Randy even could write some contracts or pull some contracts out with an entirely different perspective. And when we think about what we're expecting of those breeding females from growing and passing those genes on to their progeny for growth and efficiency, as well as being a reproductive unit themselves, we need to continue to challenge ourselves and try and think through all the strategies, be them feeding strategies or nutritional implications, all the way through to how we get those nutrients in the female to make them as successful as possible.